Well, hi there, guys. It's Tony here from Caveman Props, and I'm back today with another one of my prop talk videos. My guest today, I'm actually quite excited to talk about because if you know anything in the props world, and especially Doctor Who, the same as me, you'll know exactly who this person is. Ladies and gentlemen, my guest for today, Mike Tucker.
Hello there. Hi.
Thank you for joining us today.
Not a problem.
Okay, so basically, what I'm doing with these videos is just basically getting a bit of background information, and then we're just going to have a little chat about props and making stuff. Okay. So basically, what I want to do is I want to try and take you back how you got started in building stuff for visual effects and basically prop making. What started that all off?
Well, as a kid, I was always interested in building models. I did a huge amount of airfix kits over the years, mostly military tanks and aircraft, some ships. Hugely interested in that. Usual thing with Lego and Meccano and all these sort of kids' toys, but anything that had building and construction involved with it, I was always interested in. And the plan was, as a kid, I always wanted to get into doing models for museums because my parents always used to take me to things like Cardiff Museum or the Natural History Museum. And although I liked all the big displays, the things that I loved most where you could look through these little windows into these forced perspective miniatures, where it would be like ancient Britain or Rome or a prehistoric scene. And I was absolutely convinced that that's what I wanted to do. And then I discovered this wonderful thing called the BBC Special Effects Department. And it wasn't just building the models, it was then filming them and moving them and blowing them up. So I started changing just building the models. So I borrowed my dad's Super 8 camera and I started filming these models. So it was a fairly early decision that this was where I wanted to end up.
So did you like study courses on it, or did you literally go straight into work from school?
I was very lucky because once my parents realized that I had an interest in this thing and they could see that it was something I wanted to do, they started working out who they needed to write to at the BBC. And my careers teachers did much the same. They wrote to the BBC and my teachers at school, this is what he wants to do. Where should he go? What should he study? And we were very lucky in that 3 or 4 houses down from me was a guy who used to work as the head of drama in BBC Wales. And he was great friends with Michael John Harris, who was the head of the BBC Visual Effects Department. So he arranged for me to go and have a visit to, I think it was the old BBC studios in Cardiff, on a day that the effects department were coming down to do some work. And that in turn led to me getting a visit to the effects department in London, which was round about the time they were making Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and Tom Baker's last season. So I got to see all the props for Warrior's Gate and stuff like that being built. So at that point, I sort of was absolutely convinced that I wanted to do this. And I was already a huge fan of things like Thunderbirds and Captain Scarlet and Ray Harryhausen movies and Doctor Who and Blake Seven. So suddenly getting to the place that made some of this stuff was just fantastic. And they gave me advice. They said, do a theatre design course because that gives you a really broad base in set, costume, lighting, stage management, working to deadlines. And they encouraged me to get as much experience as I could working with local theatres. So that's what I did. And then I did a theatre design course in Croydon College. And basically at the end of that course, I said to the BBC, I've done the training that you you recommended I did. And they went, yeah, okay, start Monday. So I came in as what they call a holiday relief assistant. So when the regular assistants within the BBC used to go off for a couple of weeks on holiday, they would get sort of people like myself in to sort of help out. And you did 2 weeks, and if at the end of 2 weeks you hadn't proved yourself to be utterly useless, they then said, do you want to stay on? And there's a sort of apprenticeship scheme. And that's effectively what I did. And I ended up staying there for 20 years.
Wow, so that must have been a really wonderful experience working in that environment, especially at that time, because there's some wonderful productions now that I know we now call them classics, but there's stuff that even I sort of love. So the Doctor Who era and the Blake Seven stuff.
Well, I just missed Blake, unfortunately. I joined the department in '84, so I was 2 years away from missing Blake Seven. But Doctor Who was still in production. I mean, there'd just been the sort of the hiatus with Colin Baker. So I was there when the show had come back, and it was the big Trial of a Time Lord season. And I can remember sending a letter back to my mum going, you know, I've now just built my first Doctor Who prop. And that was very exciting. So this show that I'd grown up watching, suddenly I was there working on it. And I mean, Mike Kelt was the first designer I worked for on the opening 4 episodes of Mysterious Planet. And he was very good to me. He gave me some great little hand props to do. And he gave me the job of building the new TARDIS miniatures. So my first experience of Doctor Who is it's like, bang, police box model. You know, it's great.
Well, you can't get better than that, can you? Building the TARDIS models. Brilliant. So obviously with things like that, especially on Doctor Who, it's so iconic. When you're building a prop for something like that, especially back then when you first started, did you think that the props were going to be just as recognizable? Because there's quite a history now with just in the props world of the items, so they get quite well recognized. Did you ever think, oh, people are going to want this and collect it, or was it just you were just making something and didn't even think about that?
I did think about the iconic nature of what I'm working on, because I'd grown up knowing which props I loved. I mean, I remember as a kid watching Matt Irvin on Swap Shop, and he brought along one of his guns that he'd built from the Face of Evil. And I absolutely adored those props. I thought, you know, the 2 little glowing balls that alternated with the light and a great sound effect that went with it. It was an immediately recognizable and immediately a very iconic Doctor Who prop. And he was auctioning this as part of his quiz or competition on Swap Shop. And I tried really hard to get that. And I was very lucky in that when within a year of working at the effects department, I was working with Matt a lot. And I was over at his place one evening and I told him this story, and he left the room and came back in and went, well, I've got 3 of these, so you may as well have one, and gave me one of the Face of Evil guns. So even though I'd never got it on Swap Shop, I got it later. So that was a lovely moment. So when I was working on Doctor Who, that is in the back of my mind. How do I make something that is recognizable and obviously Doctor Who? Inexperience on my part, because I was in my early 20s when I joined the effects department, meant that I didn't always get right some of the things I was trying to do. But that's something that I think we got sort of right with experience, and not so much in Doctor Who, but certainly I think by the time I was working on things like Red Dwarf, the props and models we were making for that are instantly recognizable. So I think we got there in the end.
So that was obviously a wonderful experience, obviously working for the BBC props department and the visual effects. Now that kind of led on to you starting the model unit. How did that? Did you ever have that in the back of your mind that you wanted to have your own studio, or what kind of led to that being set up?
Well, the model unit came about purely because of the closure of the BBC special effects department. When I joined the BBC, you were sort of told that it was almost a job for life, and that you'd be there for your entire working life. And indeed, a lot of the effects designers like Matt and Tony Harding and Andy Lazelle, Peter Ragg, they did do almost their entire working life at the BBC. But obviously during the 80s, things started to change, the way the BBC was being funded and managed, and what the management of the BBC wanted changed considerably. And at that point, you could sort of see that we were on a steady curve down. I mean, when I joined the effects department in 84, 85, there were over 100 people working there. By the time we were in our final incarnation, there were 14 people working there. So it downsized massively. So I sort of figured I want to keep doing this job. And by that point, by the end of my BBC career, I was sort of specializing in model work. And I had a number of projects coming up that people wanted me to do. So I thought, well, the only way I'm going to be able to do this then is set up my own company and set it up almost like a mini visual effects department in its own right, because that's all I'd ever known. And so that's exactly what we did. We closed down at the BBC facility at Kendall Avenue on a Friday afternoon. And I spent the following week going back and forth with a van, moving all the equipment to Ealing Studios. And by the following Friday, we were up and running as the model unit and carrying on, bizarrely working on BBC shows again. So the transition from me being an in-house employee to being running my own company was a relatively straightforward one, but for me a massive learning curve, because there wasn't this backup of the BBC to run it. I was now having to run it, budget it, you know, do the payroll, do everything myself. So that was a bit of a steep learning curve, but you know, again, we've just done 15 years, so 20 years at the BBC, 15 years of my own company.
Wow. That's amazing. So it was quite an easy transition then. Obviously, yeah. It was just the paperwork stuff that you weren't quite so good on.
I mean, in retrospect, I look back at it and I can't believe it was quite as easy as it was. But we had a major program for BBC Science to do, a documentary drama about the explosion of the volcano at Krakatoa. So I knew I had this huge job that would basically, day one, I've got work. It wasn't like setting up the company and then going out to trying to find the work. We literally had a massive job straight out of the gate. So I think that helped that transition.
So I want to kind of get into your process of building a prop. How you go about it. Where do you start from? Obviously, going back to the original Doctor Who days, did you have artwork or something they said they wanted, or was you given kind of free rein? And how did you go about starting to make something?
Classic Doctor Who and Red Dwarf, we never had the arts department telling us what to do. The art department as an entity that handled everything didn't exist back in the days we were doing Doctor Who and Red Dwarf. We were very much the visual effects department, and it was made up of visual effects designers and design assistants. So we were very much encouraged to design and build our own props and models. You would obviously do that in consultation with the set design, costume, makeup, to make sure that it's cohesive. But if you were given a prop, either your designer would give you a drawing. So on Doctor Who, people like Colin Mapson regularly would do little watercolor sketches and go, that's what you're building. Other designers would go, don't really care what it looks like, you come up with something. And by the time we got to something like Red Dwarf, we were given complete free rein. We would show our own design drawings to our designer, who would approve, and then those would be shown to Rob and Doug and the directors, and then we would build the models based on our own designs. And that was true of all 6 of us who were design assistants on Red Dwarf. Everyone designed their own stuff. By the time you get to the new series of Doctor Who, it's being run by Edward Thomas and his art department. So they're sending us drawings and technical drawings of what we're doing. So very different way of working. And then you're effectively trying to just go back to the art department and say, well, this prop would be easier if we could change that dimension slightly, or this model will help us if we can do Y. So it's still collaborative, but you're very much being steered by an overall production design, as opposed to having an individual ability to design your own stuff.
So do you, your personal preference, do you like building something completely from scratch, or do you like finding objects that you can modify and build into a prop?
The finding of found items has always been a fun part of the job, and that's something that the BBC we were sort of forced into by necessity almost. So I love the idea that you can do a prop that's been built out of household items. I mean, one of my favourite props on Doctor Who, I didn't build it; it was built by an outside contractor. But it's the sniper's rifle from the Happiness Patrol, and it is literally all Gardena hose lock parts, but the overall impression of the prop looks really slick. And it was on screen for such a short space of time that Perry, the designer, just said it needs to be thrown together quickly. And I think that's a really good example of something that you could build. And I've taken that prop along to talks over the years. And you can just see, particularly in younger kids, their eyes light up of, oh, I could make that. And you almost know that they're going to leave the convention, go down to B&Q, buy a load of Gardena hoses and make their own prop. So that side of it is very satisfying if you can get it right. The flip of that is if you do get an opportunity to design and build something completely from scratch and go through the entire process and not use any found parts, that's a different satisfaction because you know you've literally created everything. Personally, almost everything ends up as a mix between the two.
I know. I kind of do that because I kind of build props for like my own personal collection, or I kind of do things on cosplay as well. And I find that my mind just goes into that state. I'm walking around a shop, and I'll see something completely out of the ordinary, and I'm just like, well, that looks exactly like, and now I could turn that into. Is that kind of like how it used to be? You'd look at inanimate objects and try and put them together?
It still is exactly like that. My wife is always amused that I'm in somewhere like a garden centre. And only last year I suddenly discovered that garden centres sell these transparent perspex domes that go on the poles for bird feeders to stop squirrels getting up them. But it's like, that's fantastic. That's a really cheap way of getting a really nice, precise perspex hemi. So suddenly it was like, oh, right, we're going to have 3 of these and they're just going to go into the shed for stock. So, yeah, I'm always finding stuff that's really useful like that.
So, obviously, you've worked on quite a number of productions. What have been some of the ones that have really stuck in your mind that you can remember straight off the bat, like for a good reason and also a bad reason?
In terms of ones that stick with me, Sylvester McCoy's first story as the Doctor, which is a show called Time and the Rani, which is not well loved by a lot of fans. But the effects work in that was extraordinary. There's miniature work, there's space stuff, there's explosions, there's Bonnie Langford spinning around in little bubbles. And I was working with an incredibly talented designer, Colin Mapson, who gave me absolutely free rein to go and build these things. So I really both enjoyed and learned an awful lot on that first show. Red Dwarf, it obviously is another high point just because the show turned into something far bigger than I think any of us had expected when we started working on it. And then when Doctor Who came back in 2005, for me to get such iconic work like Big Ben being destroyed and the Dalek Emperor and the Daleks, that was another extraordinary moment for me. And the fact that we were able to come back for the 50th, you know, the ability for me and my crew to turn around and go, well, hang on, this show that we all watched as 10-year-olds back in the 60s, we're now part of the crew that did the 50th anniversary show. That was quite an extraordinary thing to do. But I've also been incredibly lucky in the non-sci-fi shows that I've had the ability to work on. I've done shows about Krakatoa, shows about tornadoes, shows about the atomic bomb being dropped on Hiroshima, all of which have had huge, complicated special effects sequences. We did a show called The Last Day of the Dinosaurs for Discovery Channel, and suddenly I've got a workshop full of model triceratopses and brontosauruses, and it's like, wow, for somebody who grew up watching Harryhausen movies, to get a chance to do model dinosaurs, puppet dinosaurs in a digital CG age, I never thought we'd get that. I thought we'd missed that opportunity. So I've had some really, really good shows that I just count myself incredibly lucky.
Okay, you mentioned obviously CGI work there. Now, when CGI first started to be used, it seemed to be like there was a complete wash. Everyone suddenly went into CGI, and there was no real filming miniatures. What was the industry like at that time? Because now there seems to be kind of a good mix between the two, isn't there? Did it seem like there was a complete wash? Everyone suddenly rushed to CGI.
Yeah, I think after Jurassic Park came out and everyone went, oh, that's it, that's the future. We don't need you anymore. And I think a lot of productions were very keen to embrace the new toy. There was a new toy to play with, so the old toys got pushed to one side. And the problem was, from my point of view, it wasn't always being used appropriately. CG is a fantastic tool and has transformed the special effects industry. But if you use it to do the wrong thing, it's going to not work. It's not going to work for you as a production. It's not going to work for the viewer. It's also not necessarily the cheapest way of doing it. And sometimes you can come back to, well, I can do exactly the same shot cheaper. Everyone always says it's the other way around, that model work is more expensive than CG because you have to factor in the filming and the studio and the lights. But if your CG house is one of these massive facilities in central London with 600 animators working there that needs to cover its overheads and keep its shareholders happy, they want to make money. I think we have reached a point where things are starting to settle. You've got directors on movies like J.J. Abrams and shows like The Mandalorian that are now using a nice mix of both traditional model work and CG, but blending them in a really clever way. And I was delighted that season 2 of The Mandalorian got back Phil Tippett to do some stop motion work. Now, they still comped it digitally, but that's fantastic that Phil Tippett's still doing stop motion, in 2021. Cameras have also changed the way we work. The ability to be able to shoot something and see what you shot immediately, as opposed to, right, well, we've shot it on film, we'll send the film off for processing, we'll find out whether we got the shot tomorrow morning, meant that you couldn't break down a miniature set just in case you didn't get the shot. Whereas now, using a digital high-speed camera, I can film it, review it, go, we got that, move on, set the next thing up. So it speeded us up enormously. So I hope that the future is use the best tool for the job, regardless of whether that's CG or model. I hope that's the way we're going to go.
I hope so too. I have to admit, you watch some films and you know what era it's from by the amount of CGI that's in it. And I think now with the nice blend of it, you can tell whether, especially I think one of the best ones was like Babylon 5. I mean, I love Babylon 5, but when you look at the space scenes, you can tell all the ships are computer generated. Whereas when they mix the two and you can tell it's a model, it looks like a real spaceship going through space.
Yeah, I mean, Deep Space Nine is a really good example of that. It's got the CG for things like the wormhole appearing and disappearing, but the station itself was a beautiful motion control miniature. To me, that gives you the best of both worlds. You've got the miniature that gives you all those hard surface textures and just something you feel in your gut that you know that you're looking at something real. But the wormhole effects are something that would be an incredible tricky thing to do with Cloud Tank or opticals. So being able to blend those two things together and get a really good overall frame for the viewer, for the fan, you've got what I think is what we should all be aiming for, is how do we make this the best thing you can look at? And it also keeps both the digital and the practical guys happy. So that would be my preference always, to try and mix these two, and for the two departments to work together, not keep knocking heads on who's going to get the budget.
Okay, now you've a little while ago you got asked to restore some props. You've done props restoring before, but you got asked to restore some items for the Doctor Who experience.
Yeah.
What was that like? Because that must have been, one, very proud to be asked, but it's also quite a big responsibility to restore an item, because obviously the item was never meant to survive past filming.
Yeah.
But obviously restoring it so it was there for future generations is quite a big job. So, you know, what was that like? Because I know on some bits you had to make a decision on what could be saved and what had to be remade again from scratch.
Yeah, I mean, the Doctor Who experience job was extraordinary, because I got to handle props that not only had I watched on TV, but I'd remembered going to see at Blackpool and Longley Doctor Who exhibitions. And then suddenly they're all delivered to my workshop, and it's like, oh my God, there's the giant robot, there's the TARDIS console. So that was fantastic. And the decision that I made with the guys at Doctor Who Experience is, we're going to restore them in exactly the same way that they would have been originally made, and using exactly the same materials. And because a lot of the guys who work with me are ex-BBC, and in some cases ex-BBC who had worked on the original productions, I tried to sort of match people up with their eras properly. So that meant on stuff like the giant robot, if it had an old car fitting on part of the chest, we went out and sourced a vintage car fitting, or took a mold off the one that was surviving. So the hard surface objects, that was relatively straightforward, because it was just a question of cleaning them up, bashing out the dents, putting them back together. When you get to the latex items, you're quite right. These things haven't been built to last more than the 2 weeks that you're making the show. And the idea that you've got a prop that's now 40 years old and built out of latex, it's amazing that anything survives. But that latex is continuing to deteriorate. It's continuing to rot. So when we were presented with something like the Ice Warrior, the chest was in great condition because that was fiberglass, and it got a little brittle, but on the whole, we could patch that up, and that was great. The head was missing, the arm was missing, and we had one leg, and it was going sticky the way that old latex starts to go. So you know that you're not going to be able to salvage that. That is going to fall apart within a matter of weeks. So we did make the decision, if we take a mold off it now, we've preserved the look of it exactly as it is at this point. We will destroy the original in doing so. But what we got out of it was a completely accurate Ice Warrior leg for our version. It also gave us enough of the original textures in the sculpt to be able to recreate the arms and the heads accurately. And what we've now got is not only an Ice Warrior that will probably survive another 10-15 years, particularly given that it's not being worn by an actor, and therefore it's not being sweated into, because that's one of the things that rots the latex. But we also now have a set of molds, so that if it does rot, we can knock another one out. So that was a fairly straightforward decision to make. When it came to something like the Morbius monster, that was in appalling condition, and taking a mold off it would completely destroy it, to the point that there would have been nothing left of the original. So that was a question of, right, take what's there, glue it onto a mannequin so that it no longer needs to be physically manhandled. You can now just push it around on a wheeled base and then recreate all the parts that have deteriorated to the point that there's nothing left. So that was making a new claw, putting a new arm, human arm on it, rebuilding the head. But again, I was very lucky. When I was at the effects department in the mold store, there was a mold that I recognized as, well, that's the brain from the brain of Morbius. And I took a cast out of it. So when 20 years later I'm asked to refurbish Morbius, I've actually got the correct brain to go back into it. So I've been very lucky in that a lot of the refurbs I've been asked to do, I've actually been able to source a lot of the original parts for it just because of my background. And I think that was partly the decision of why we were given the job in the first place. They knew that we would do the stuff accurately. And I couldn't be happier with the way Morbius came out. I mean, he looks great now. Really pleased with the way he looked, especially given how sad that was when it was delivered to the workshop. It was in a really poor state. But it's strange. Stuff from 40 years ago is sometimes in better condition than a prop that was made in the 80s. And it's purely down to the quality of the latex that was being used at the time and how sweaty the actors got. So something like an original Sea Devil, which I've refurbished a couple of those now from 73, weirdly, the fact that they were put in the sea and the guys came out of salt water, the salt water's almost like cured the latex and they've gone hard like leather. So they're probably going to last for years. Whereas something like the Vervoids from Colin Baker's era, very few of them survived because the latex was so thin and the foam was so fine that they actually didn't last very well, and those rotted faster. You never know what you're going to end up with. You never know what you're going to be presented with when you open that box and go, this is what you're refurbishing.
But it's lucky that you've managed to actually save those things so that they are now kind of around for future generations to actually see.
Yeah.
They actually see the original. They're not looking at a replica. And I think it's wonderful that you've been managed to source, although not the original parts, but like the original molds, or find the original parts to actually recreate it. Because I think that works a lot better than trying to add something else to it to make it look right.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, now we want to try and bring things a little bit forward. I know when we originally spoke a little while ago, you wasn't able to talk to me because you was in the middle of a project, and obviously you're not allowed to talk about things like that when you're in the middle of it. Is there anything that you've been working on that's coming up that you're allowed to speak to us about?
It's a tricky one because it's been announced now. So it's a project called Time Fracture, which is happening later this month. But as of yet, they haven't actually shown any images or given any indication of what it is we've built for it. So I'm still in the same position. I can tell you that we worked on Time Fracture, but I can't tell you what we've done. What we have been working on is we were involved in some preliminary model work for an episode of The Crown that went out earlier in the year. And we've literally just had some of our work in a Channel 4 comedy show called Taskmaster. So we've done some props and bits and pieces for that. And of course, I mean, I'm still sort of occasionally dropping into things like the Doctor Who DVD and Blu-ray range. So when they re-released Power of the Daleks last year, we did a recreation of the Dalek conveyor belt as it would have originally been done. So little bits and pieces still keep, coming back to Doctor Who as well. But yeah, at the moment, the project I was talking about when we first spoke, I still can't tell you what we've done because they haven't announced it.
Not a problem. Obviously, I don't want to get you into trouble on that.
I think Time Fracture actually is being released, or the first day is actually something. It's either next week or the week after.
Cool. So we have to look forward to that coming out. So basically, moving on from that, what does the future hold for you and for like the model unit? What do we have? What's in the future for you?
The future at the moment is something of an unknown. The pandemic hasn't helped a lot because trying to keep a big workshop open when there's no work going through it has been an impossibility. So we have sadly had to vacate our workshop premises at Ealing, and everything has gone into storage. Whether that means I will be back again sort of depends how the industry bounces back and what sort of shows are being made. There is obviously an awful lot of work going on in the UK at the moment, but everything is teetering on the edge of, well, if your lead actor or your director or your cameraman goes down with COVID, then everything shuts down again. So it's tricky times to predict anything at the moment. I've certainly been sent a couple of scripts. I'm certainly hopeful that work is coming back in at some point. I just can't predict when at the moment.
Well, we hope that it does, because obviously we love seeing your work on the TV, and because it is absolutely amazing, some of the stuff that you've worked on. So obviously I kind of hope, fingers crossed, that it does pick up again, as we all do in all industries at the moment. But because that would be nice. But it obviously has been a tough time for you at the moment.
Yeah. As I said, you need a steady throughput of work in order to maintain a facility with just rent, overheads. It's an expensive industry to stay in, and it requires you to keep feeding the machine. I am a lucky individual within all this, in that, of course, I have my writing that I can always fall back on, and I have indeed been doing some nice writing projects during lockdown to keep me going. But obviously, what I want to do is be back building spacecraft models, props, blowing stuff up, getting back in a studio and filming miniatures again. So, as soon as I can, I'll be out there and trying to sort of find the next project.
Okay, well, we'll keep our fingers crossed for you on that, and we really do hope that it does pick up for you.
Brilliant, thank you.
Okay, well, I think that's about all the time we have for today. Mike, I want to thank you very much for taking the time out to actually speak to us today. It's been a real pleasure.
No, I've really
enjoyed it. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. So there you go, guys. Hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Please like, please subscribe, and I will see you in the next video soon.